Hi, all, and welcome to week 2 of Effective Supervision and Evaluation. I'm Maccabee. Really excited to be working with you on this. This video is a bit longer than last week's, and we have a lot more to cover, so let's dive right in. The objectives for the week. First, we're going to develop a personal plan for classroom visits over the course of the next year that comports with best practices in teacher supervision, and that's going to include a review of the 3 most popular frameworks for teacher supervision and evaluation. Second, we're going to identify what to look for during classroom visits that's going to maximize teacher growth and student learning. Third, we're going to begin to develop or adapt a template for class visits for data gathering in your school that outlines the criteria on which teachers are evaluated. Then we're going to differentiate between feedback that shuts teachers down and that which helps teachers grow. We're going to reflect on how this supervision can impact teacher evaluation. And the last thing I'll say for those of you who don't observe teachers yet or think you might never is that you should try, meaning to observe teachers, either as a peer coach if you're another teacher in the school, or just because you want to see what's going on in classrooms. For example, if you're on the advancement team in your school and you don't normally have a supervisory role in the classroom, it's actually great to get in there and see what's going on. Everyone should be in classrooms, and most teachers would welcome you in, and I bet you can find someone who would be willing to do so. So the first challenge of conducting classroom visits is time. Where in your calendar can you ever make time for these things? So the first thing you have to do if you plan to do anything like this in any role in your school is to create a manageable list of the number of observations you're going to make and figure out how often you're going to be visiting each person you're going to see. Before we do that, we have to discuss the kind of visit you're going to make to a classroom. Are these short pop-in visits or long full class visits that include a pre-conference and a post-conference? Ultimately, you have to decide that for yourself. And you may choose to follow one model or another very strictly, or some combination of the models. You'll be reading about this to help you further develop your personal stance on this issue. And to help illustrate the importance of frequent classroom visits, which I think is the most important point I want to make here, I want to share with you some graphics developed by Kim Marshall. On average, there are about 180 days in a school year. Jewish schools have somewhere between 160 to 180, depending on the school. And the average teacher, especially in middle school and high school, teaches about 5 classes per day. So that equals 900 classes. So in your school, you probably have a few master teachers, some solid teachers who make up the majority of your faculty, a few mediocre teachers, and even a handful of teachers whose performance is regularly below par. And they're in your school for a variety of reasons, I'm sure, just like they're in mine. What's obvious, but bears discussion, is that no teacher is consistently great or terrible every single day. Master teachers have some less masterful days, and unsatisfactory teachers even have some good days. So for example, a master teacher's year might look like this. Most classes are masterful in the blue, the 4s, with a fair number of solid classes, and even some mediocre and unsatisfactory classes. A solid teacher's class would be mostly solid with a fair number of classes where she shows what she's really capable of, and about an equal number of classes that aren't quite up to her potential. The mediocre teacher's year is similar, mostly mediocre with scattered moments of brilliance and some really unsatisfactory classes. So what becomes clear is that if you were to plan only 2 visits a year, for example, 1 per semester, to any of these teachers' classes, and they knew about them in advance, you would likely see 2 master level classes because each of the teachers is capable of a master level or something very close to it. And with the right incentive, i.e. your biannual observation, the teacher will probably perform at that level. So 2 visits a year is probably not enough to give you a picture of what a teacher's class is really like or any employee's work is really like. And more importantly, for our purposes, to provide the type of support that the teacher needs to grow. Rather, it's frequent visits followed by feedback and conversation that will lead to growth. So a question that arises is, how do I do this supervision for growth thing, which sounds very chummy and great, and align that with my need to evaluate the people who work for me? If the visits are observational, not evaluative, then what do I do? So that's a subject requiring a lot more time and depth than we really have room for in this short module, but it's a good place to begin the conversation. And in short, evaluation is based on student growth and learning and teacher growth. If your students are achieving clear learning goals and your teachers are achieving the growth goals they've set for themselves that you looked at, thinking back to our last week, your evaluation will be relatively easy. So when considering scheduling your classroom observations, it's important to understand different models of visits and the benefits and drawbacks of each. Essentially, there are three basic models. There's the very short pop-in, 3 to 5 minutes, the mid-length observation, 10 to 20 minutes, and a full class observation, 30 minutes to a full period. So the pop-in visit, sometimes referred to as the Downey walkthrough, I like that gopher there. It was in vogue recently. It's in fact what I think most principals do these days. Its main focus can really only be on student safety and what we loosely refer to as quote unquote engagement. And don't get me started on engagement. We can have a nice conversation about that over a beer one day. Basically, engagement can be addressed by the question, do the students appear to be engaged in the educational exercise the teacher is leading them through? Then there's the mid-range visit, which allows the supervisor to sit in the room, gather data about what the teacher and students are doing and saying, and get a sense for the learning that's going on. For most administrators, these are the most effective types of observations. They're substantive enough to allow the supervisor to share useful feedback with the teacher, and are short enough that the supervisor can do them with regularity. Then there's the full class visit, which needs not actually be a full class, but should comprise the majority of it. And it's the most robust type of observation. It allows the observer to really feel like a student in the room and be absorbed in the lesson. It's usually preceded by a pre-conference and then a post-conference afterwards, and it provides mountains of data for the observer and the teacher. They can be incredibly valuable, but because of the time commitment they require, they're not really suitable as a regular tool for most school leaders. In your reading, you'll review 3 of the most popular frameworks for teacher supervision and evaluation and discuss the benefits and drawbacks of each. Ultimately, you'll make a choice about which one you'll be using to guide your work. You actually may have already chosen one, your school might be using one, but I think it's worthwhile to think about these different frameworks and how they might impact your work. There are 3 frameworks of teacher supervision and evaluation that seem really to dominate the field now, and they've been created by well-respected educators whose views comport with what we've been talking about here and whose work has had a significant impact on the field. They are Charlotte Danielson, Kim Marshall, and Dr. Robert Marzano. A lot of people use the Danielson framework. Kim Marshall in the middle there is one of people now are beginning to use a lot. A lot of people think that Kim was a woman or that he was Asian. He's not. He's from Boston. And then Dr. Robert Marzano is one of the more popular, especially in terms of the available literature. So you'll review and skim each of these frameworks during your reading. Then you're going to discuss with your cohort the benefits and drawbacks of each of the frameworks and choose one you'd like to work with. Again, you may already have a preference, and that's fine. Your rationale for choosing that framework will be valuable to the group, and your reevaluation of the other frameworks will hopefully be valuable to you. So we know that in a typical school, there are probably as many definitions of effective practice as there are professionals in the building. Without a shared vision of effective practice, communication between teachers and leaders and among teachers themselves is likely to be unproductive. So a reliable and validated observational protocol provides everyone in the school with a shared definition of effective practice and a common method for looking at these practices in the classroom. Importantly, by using a reliable and validated tool, i.e. one that has shown capacity for consistent use across observers and across time, as well as a relation to desired student outcomes, teachers and administrators can have confidence that their shared definition of quality practice is leading them to focus on the types of classroom behaviors that really make a difference for students. So how do you know what to look for when you're visiting a class? Is instinct enough? Is experience enough? It's important to remember that your job as an observer is to look for things that will help the teacher you're working with improve his or her practice. These might include things he does well that you want to reinforce and things that can be tweaked. Each of the frameworks mentioned captures some of the most important things to look for. The most important similarity is that all these frameworks focus on what the authors believe are the domains of good teaching, and that each defines what those elements look like in practice. I remember sitting with a group of teachers and administrators a few years ago as we evaluated a lesson we had observed. Many of the teachers in the room reported afterwards that the students were, quote unquote, not engaged in the lesson. So I pressed them to find out like kind of what they meant by engaged. Those teachers responded that the students must have been really bored or disinterested. However, when we looked at the data, which said that every student was on task and doing what the teacher in their room had asked them to do, we didn't see evidence at all that the students weren't engaged. So I suggested, maybe a little bit cheekily, that perhaps it was the adult evaluators, the adult observers who were bored. After all, it was a third grade math lesson that went for about 12 minutes with little change in the activity. And even though the students were all on task from what we could see, the adults watching the lesson were bored. That makes sense. But they didn't separate their own feelings about the lesson from what was actually happening, and they projected their boredom onto the kids using the jargon of engagement. So that's a pitfall of observation, placing your judgment on the data. That's why it's important to keep the disposition of data gathering in mind, just the facts, ma'am. So we'll speak more about that when we look at feedback. It's also a reminder of how important tools can be when we observe classroom teaching and learning. So using tools when observing classes is a great way to make sure that the observation is transparent, that it meets your goals, and that it helps the teacher grow and learn. Checklists are usually a dangerous tool because they quantify practice without providing evidence. So they reduce the art and the science of teaching to a scorecard instead of a conversation. So there are several tools one could use, which are in the research section. Silver and Strong, which you're looking at here, is a good one. I especially like the pre-conference planning sheet. In addition, an observation worksheet is great because it makes sure the observer records evidence and identifies impact on student learning. And you can find a variety of these all over the internet, and I have some copies for you. The most important part is recording data, not interpretations. Ultimately, supervision of teaching is an area of school leadership that has been the subject of a vast body of literature, academic and popular. It's something that takes deep study and a lot of practice. Most important in this practice is the disposition that every teacher can learn, the disposition towards data gathering and away from judgment, and the disposition towards transparency and sharing. Looking forward to seeing your work for this week. And if you have any questions about anything technical or otherwise, please feel free to be in touch. Have a great one.